third floor of the Penobscot County Appellate Courthouse smelled of old varnish and older arguments. Sunlight came through the tall windows in slanting columns, catching the dust that no janitor had ever fully banished from a room where men in robes had been making decisions for 140 years. Adelaide Whitford sat very still at the petitioner's table. She wore a gray blouse she had ironed 3 times that morning, and a borrowed blue blazer that fit her almost well enough. Her hands rested flat on the wooden table, palms down, the way a woman holds herself when she is trying not to tremble. Beside her, on a chair that was too tall for her feet to touch the floor, sat a small girl with dark braids and a stuffed rabbit pressed against her stomach. Wren Whitford was 7 years old. She had not yet learned that you were supposed to look afraid in courtrooms. She watched the judge the way she watched everything, with patient, unblinking interest. Adley felt her daughter's hand find hers under the table, the small fingers wrapped around her thumb. The judge looked up from the papers in front of her. The gavel rose, the gavel fell, and just before the wood struck the block, Adley closed her eyes and the sound of the strike traveled backward through her, all the way back to the morning 4 months earlier, when she had stood in a graveyard outside Portland, with her hands buried in the pockets of a coat that was too thin for the wind. The cemetery sat on a low hill above the harbor. From where she stood, she could see the masts of the fishing boats moving in the slow gray water, and beyond them the line where the ocean became a different kind of gray, and beyond that nothing at all. The morning was the kind of cold that gets into the bones and stays there. She had been a widow for exactly 1 year. The headstone was simple. She had not been able to afford anything more. Tobias Whitford, beloved husband and father. The dates beneath his name spanned 41 years. She had read those numbers 100 times, and they still did not seem like enough. She crouched down and laid a single white rose against the base of the stone. The petals trembled in the wind. She did not let herself cry because she had decided long ago that she would do her crying in private behind closed doors in the bathroom of whatever apartment she happened to be losing that month. Cemeteries were for other things. Cemeteries were for talking. "I lost the job," she said quietly to the stone. "The cleaning job at the medical office, the one I told you about. They restructured. That is the word they used. Restructured." She paused. The wind moved her hair across her forehead. "The insurance still has not paid out. They say the report says you were responsible. They say there was a violation of safety protocol on your part." "I know that is not true, Toby. I know you. I know how you stood at that station every day. You were the most careful man I ever knew." Wren had stayed in the car. Adley had asked her to. Some conversations were not meant for a 7-year-old, even one who understood more than she should. The packing plant had ground its slow legal gears for a year, and at the end of that year, a manila envelope had come to her apartment with a final determination signed by a sheriff she had never met. Operator error. No corporate liability. The insurance company had read the determination and closed the file the same day. She thought about the sheriff's signature now standing in the cemetery. She thought about the way the name had been pressed into the paper. Hollis Marlowe. She had never met the man. He worked out of Penobscot County, which was not a place she had any reason to think about. She did not know yet that she would soon have every reason to think about him. "I'm going to find a way," she told the stone. "I do not know what way yet, but I'm going to find one. For her. For you. I promise." She kissed her gloved fingers and pressed them to the cold granite. Then she stood up and walked back to the car, where Wren was waiting in the back seat with her stuffed rabbit and a library book about birds of New England, her small brow furrowed over a paragraph about ospreys. The eviction notice was waiting for her on the apartment door when they got home. The landlord was a man named Earl Spivey, who managed 3 buildings in the part of Portland that the tourist brochures never showed. He was not cruel exactly. He was just a man who had decided long ago that compassion was a luxury he could not afford in his line of work. The notice was typed on a form he had clearly used many times with the relevant blanks filled in by hand. 3 months in arrears, final notice, vacate by April 15th. Adley read it twice on the small landing outside the door. It was the 7th of April. She had 8 days. Inside the apartment was the same as she had left it that morning. 2 rooms above a laundromat in the part of the city where the streetlights flickered in patterns that nobody bothered to fix. The radiator clanked through every winter night like something desperate trying to escape. The kitchen window faced a brick wall, but it had been theirs. She looked at Wren, who had set down her library book and was watching her mother's face the way she always did, with that particular attention that some children develop when they have learned that the adults in their world are weather they have to read. "It is going to be all right," Adley said. Wren nodded slowly. It was the kind of nod a child gives when she does not entirely believe what she has been told, but understands that her mother needs her to pretend. That night, after Wren was asleep, Adley sat on the floor of the apartment with her checkbook and a pencil and the calculator on her phone, and she did the arithmetic of her life one more time the way she had done it 1,000 times in the last year. The numbers had not changed. The numbers were always the same. The numbers were wrong, and they had been wrong for a long time. She had $411 in checking. She had $63 in cash folded into the cookie tin where she kept things she could not afford to lose. She had a sister in Boston named Rosalind who had a couch but did not have enough room. She had a mother in Vermont who had room, but had spent most of her life pretending that her younger daughter's circumstances were a matter of personal choice. She had applied to every shelter within a 40-mile radius and been placed on waiting lists that moved like glaciers. She had a daughter who needed continuity, who needed a school, who needed a place where the floor was solid under her feet and the walls did not echo the sound of an empty future. She did not have a plan. She had a direction. The direction was north. They drove on the morning of the 11th of April. The Subaru was 12 years old, and the left tail light had been cracked since the previous summer when Adley had not been able to afford to fix it. She had loaded everything they were keeping into the back: 2 garbage bags of clothes, 3 cardboard boxes held together with packing tape, a laundry basket with kitchen things, the cookie tin with the cash, Wren's library book, and her stuffed rabbit whose name was Mr. Buttonwood. She had walked through the empty apartment one last time before she locked the door. Wren had asked her, standing in the bare front room with her bag over her shoulder, "Why does the floor echo now, Mama?" It was a question Adley would think about many times in the months that followed. "Because there is nothing in the room anymore," she had said. "Empty rooms echo. Are we gonna be empty too, Mama?" She had pulled her daughter against her chest then and held her tight enough to feel the small heart beating through both their coats. "No," she had said, "we are never gonna be empty. You hear me? Never." They drove north. She didn't know exactly where she was going. She had a tank and a half of gas and a vague idea that there were small towns along the coast above Bangor where rents were cheap because nobody had reason to live there anymore. She drove with the radio off. She watched the landscape change from the gray suburbs of Portland to the rolling birch and pine that meant they had passed out of the part of Maine where the maps were detailed. By the early afternoon, they had crossed into Penobscot County. The gas station sat at the intersection of a state route and a smaller road that disappeared into the trees. It was the kind of station that sold lottery tickets and sandwiches in plastic triangles and had a community board beside the door covered in layers of colored paper that had been there for years. Adley pulled in because the needle was dropping, and Wren needed a bathroom and her own legs ached from gripping the steering wheel. She put $13 of regular into the tank. She bought a bottle of water and a package of crackers and a small jar of peanut butter for 63 cents, under $5. On the way out, while Wren was washing her hands at the cracked sink visible through the open bathroom door, Adley stopped at the community board. She had stopped looking at community boards months ago. Looking at things she could not have was like pressing on a bruise. But something made her look this time. Maybe it was the word that caught her eye in plain black ink on white paper. No border, no decoration, just a notice. Property transfer notice. Pembroke Chapel, 14 Hollow Creek Road, Pembroke Township. Unclaimed estate property. One-time acquisition. As is condition. All structural defects disclosed. Minimum administrative transfer fee $1. Interested parties must present to Pembroke Township office by April 30th. Property will revert to county demolition order if unclaimed. Adley read it twice. She read it a third time. $1. A chapel for $1. She knew enough about the world to know there was a catch. Properties were not given away for $1 without a catch. They were given away because they were dangerous or worthless or legally complicated or all three. She had heard of these transfers before. Counties did them to clear liability from their books. The buildings went to whoever was foolish enough to take them, and the county washed its hands. But Wren was waiting in the car, now climbing into the back seat with her library book, and they had nowhere to sleep tonight. Adley took the notice off the board. She folded it carefully. She put it in her pocket. The Pembroke Township office was a squat building on a side street called Mercer Lane. It smelled of old carpet and stale coffee. The woman behind the front counter was heavy-set with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she looked up when Adley came in with Wren trailing behind her. "I'm here about the chapel," Adley said. "The transfer notice, St. No Pembroke Chapel." The woman's expression did something subtle. Adley caught it but could not name it. There was a flicker of something that might have been recognition, or warning, or both. "You want to claim it," the woman said. "I want to know what is wrong with it first." The woman almost smiled. "Honey, what is not wrong with it?" She pulled out a thick folder from the cabinet behind her and laid it open on the counter. Built in 1887. Last active congregation dissolved in 1962. Passed through 3 different private owners. All of them abandoned the property within a few years. The last owner died intestate in 2018. No heirs, no will. It has been sitting in township limbo ever since. Has anyone else come in to ask about it? The woman looked at her over the rims of the reading glasses. "In 6 years, you are the first." 6 years. The woman flipped to a page of photographs. The chapel was a small gray stone building, set back from a dirt road surrounded by oaks that had grown enormous around it. The bell tower leaned slightly to one side. Plywood covered the windows. The front door was chained shut. "The administrative transfer fee is $1, the woman said. "You assume all tax liability going forward. There are no current outstanding taxes because of the estate dissolution waiver. But you cannot live in it without a certificate of occupancy." The structural assessment in this folder lists multiple concerns. The bell tower, the roof, the foundation, the east wall has significant settling. "I understand." The woman paused. There was that flicker again. "You should also know," she said, lowering her voice slightly, "that there has been interest in this property. Not from buyers exactly. From someone who has been watching the file." "Who?" The woman started to answer. The door behind Adley opened. A current of cold air came in with the woman who entered. She was in her early 60s with silver hair cut into a precise bob and the kind of cashmere coat that was the color of stone in winter. She wore pearls at her throat. Her shoes had not seen mud in 20 years. She moved through the front door of the township office the way certain people move through any space, with the absolute certainty that the room had been waiting for her arrival. She smiled at Adley. "Constance Whitlock." The woman behind the counter went very still. Adley felt something tighten in her chest. She didn't know why exactly. It was the smile. The smile was the wrong smile. It was the smile of a woman who had been smiling that smile for so long that the muscles of her face had memorized it, and behind the smile there was nothing at all. I could not help overhearing Constance said, "You are interested in the chapel." "I am. How wonderful. I have lived in Pembroke all my life. The chapel has always been a special place to me, a piece of our history. It is so good to see someone come in to ask about it." She extended a hand, soft and pale, with 3 rings on it. Adley shook it. The fingers were cold. "Constance Whitlock," the woman said again. "The Whitlocks have been in this part of Maine since 1762. We take a great deal of pride in the preservation of our local heritage." Adley said nothing. Constance kept smiling. "I will be honest with you, dear," she said. "The chapel is in terrible condition. The county has wanted to demolish it for years. I have personally been advocating for its preservation, and I had been intending to come in this very week to inquire about acquiring it myself. To save it, you understand, as a private restoration project, a gift to the community." "I see," Adley said. "But if you have already begun the process, I would be more than happy to facilitate a different arrangement. The Whitlock Family Foundation would be very interested in compensating you for your time and your interest in the property. Shall we say $8,000 in exchange for your stepping aside?" Adley felt her own breath go quiet in her throat. $8,000. The number sat in the air of the township office like an animal that had been let out of a cage. She thought about her $63 in cash. She thought about Wren in the back seat of the Subaru, reading about ospreys. She thought about the eviction notice that was now in the past. She thought about every motel room she could rent with $8,000, every grocery bill she could pay, every utility bill, every month she could buy with money that had been offered to her for the simple act of standing aside. She thought about Constance Whitlock's smile. The smile told her everything. A property that was being given away for $1 was suddenly worth $8,000 to a woman in cashmere who had walked in within 15 minutes of Adley's arrival, as if she had been informed. The woman behind the counter still had not moved. "I appreciate the offer," Adley said quietly, "but I am going to complete the transfer." Constance's smile did not change. The eyes above it changed. "Are you certain, dear?" "I am. That property is in very poor condition. You may find it more difficult than you anticipate. There are many complications. Liability, permits, local ordinances. I would hate for you to find yourself in a situation that you were not prepared to handle. I appreciate your concern. Are you from Pembroke, dear?" "No. Where are you from?" "Portland." "How interesting. And what brings you to our town?" Adley did not answer. She turned back to the woman at the counter. "Where do I sign?" The papers came out. Adley signed her name on 3 lines. She handed over the $1 from her wallet, the only physical dollar she had, the one she had kept tucked into the side pocket, because some part of her had wanted a buffer between her cash and the rest of her life. The woman behind the counter took the $1. She gave Adley a receipt and a copy of the deed and a folder of documents that covered the legal transfer, the tax waiver, the disclosure of structural defects, and the directions to the property at 14 Hollow Creek Road. Constance watched the entire process without speaking. When Adley turned to leave, Constance was standing between her and the door. Not blocking her exactly, just standing there with her cashmere coat and her pearls and her hand at her side. "You do not understand what you have just acquired," the older woman said. Adley met her eyes. "I think I understand more than you realize," she said. She walked past Constance Whitlock and out the door. The drive to Hollow Creek Road took 20 minutes. The road itself was barely a road. A two-track lane of cracked asphalt that had been reclaimed in places by grass growing up through the fractures. Old oaks lined both sides, their roots pushing up the surface into shapes that were closer to geology than pavement. Wren rode in the back, looking out the window with the focused interest she brought to everything new. "Where are we going, Mama?" "Home," Adley said, and the word came out steadier than she had expected. The chapel appeared through the trees, and Adley stopped the car. The photographs in the township folder had not done it justice. They had captured the dilapidation. They had not captured the dignity. The walls were granite gray and weathered, but the kind of stone that had been quarried from somewhere in this same main earth and had stood without yielding for 139 years. The oaks around the chapel had grown into massive cathedral forms of their own, their canopies interlocking overhead, so that the small stone building sat in a kind of natural nave, and the spring light came down through the green-fringed branches and fell across the roof in patterns that shifted with the wind. The bell tower leaned slightly, but it still stood. The grounds were wild, chest-high weeds and volunteer saplings reclaiming the paths, vines climbing the east wall, the remains of an iron fence with an arched gate that had rusted but had not fallen. Beneath the wildness, Adley could see the bones of what had been. A small, stacked stone garden wall, the faint curve of a path still visible in the earth. She got out of the car. The air smelled of green things and old stone and something underneath it she could not name. A mineral smell, cool and faintly sweet, like water moving slowly through limestone underground. Wren climbed out behind her. The little girl stood looking up at the chapel with her head tilted the way she had stood looking at the cemetery a year ago. She had a way of holding still in front of important things, as though stillness was the only proper response. "It is big," she said. "It is." "It looks sad, Mama. Things that have been forgotten look sad. That does not mean they are." Wren considered this for a long moment. "Can we go in?" The chain on the front door had a padlock on it that had been there long enough to rust itself partly open. The shackle had corroded in a way that allowed it to be jiggled free if you had the patience. Adley worked at it for several minutes while Wren examined a stone near the door that had a depression in the surface filled with rainwater. "It is a bird bath," Wren announced. The padlock came open. The door was solid oak, swollen in its frame from decades of moisture, and it took both of them pushing to convince it to move. When it did, it groaned with a sound so deep it seemed to come from the foundations of the building itself. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of stone and old wood, and the faint ghost of something that had once been candle smoke. The interior was a single room, the nave, wooden pews still in place, most of them structurally sound, all of them covered in a thick layer of dust and bird droppings. The floor was wide plank oak darkened with age. The planks gapped slightly where the wood had shrunk over time. At the far end, beneath a stained glass window that had retained most of its glass, stood a simple wooden altar table. The window depicted a woman in blue, cracked in two places, repaired at some point with what looked like clear tape that had long since yellowed and peeled away. Light came through the gaps in the boarded east windows in thin gold bars striping the dusty floor. Wren walked slowly down the center aisle between the pews. Her footsteps sounded in the silence. Each one was followed by a faint resonance, the floor carrying and amplifying each impact just slightly. She stopped. She took a step. She listened. She took another step. "Mama," she said. "Yes, I hear it." "What?" "The floor." Adley had been standing at the back of the nave, looking up at the cracked window. She turned now and walked forward to where her daughter stood, and she stopped, and she put her own foot down on the wide plank oak. The sound came back to her changed. There was a quality to it that went beyond ordinary resonance. There was a depth to it, as if each footstep traveled farther than it should, as if below the oak planks there was somewhere for the sound to go. Why does the floor echo Mama? Adley didn't answer right away. She walked forward slowly, watching the boards. The planks were old growth oak, every one of them running straight and true along the length of the nave. But near the altar the planks looked subtly different, not just dirtier, a different shade, as if they had been replaced at some point with wood from a different source, or as if something below that section kept the wood differently conditioned. She stopped near the altar. She pressed her foot down deliberately. The echo came back deeper, broader, as if the space below this section of floor was larger than the space below the rest. She crouched and looked at the floor. In the dust, almost invisible, she saw a seam. A line too straight and too deliberate to be a natural gap between planks. She looked at the altar table. It had been moved. She could see the marks in the dust where its feet had originally stood, several inches to the left of where it stood now. Someone had moved it and never moved it back. Mama. Wren had come up beside her. She was pointing at the stone base of the altar, down low, in the corner of the stone half hidden under decades of grime. There it was, an iron ring set flush with the stone, folded down, the kind of ring that lay flat when not in use. A handle. Adley stared at it for a long moment. Then she stood up and walked to the back of the nave and looked out through the open door at the Subaru with the cracked tail light and the 2 garbage bags and the 3 cardboard boxes and the laundry basket. She walked back inside. She looked at the iron ring. She did not pull on it, not yet. She looked at the floor that echoed and the altar that had been moved and the woman in the cracked blue window watching from the front with her patient, ancient face. She looked at her daughter. "We need to do something first," she said. "Come on." She led Wren back outside into the late afternoon light. The sun was low now over the oaks and the air had gone cool. Adley unloaded the sleeping bags from the trunk and the lantern she had bought for emergencies and the small camp stove she had inherited from Tobias. She set up a sleeping nest in the back of the Subaru for Wren, who climbed in with Mr. Buttonwood and her library book, and accepted the arrangement without complaint. Adley sat in the driver's seat with the door cracked and listened to the woods, owls in the deep trees, the small movement of something in the weeds, the far-off calling of a loon on a lake she could not see. She thought about Constance Whitlock. She thought about the $8,000. She thought about the way the woman had said, "You do not understand what you have just acquired." Adley believed her. She believed that she did not understand. She also believed that whatever was in the chapel, Constance Whitlock had been watching for it, waiting for it, and had known somehow the moment it was being claimed by someone else. That meant something was there. Whatever was there, Adley intended to find it before Constance did. She slept badly. She woke before dawn. She lay in the front seat with her eyes open and watched the sky go from black to the color of cold iron to a pale gray that meant morning was coming. And she thought about her daughter sleeping in the back, and she made a decision. She would go down. Whatever was below the floor, she would see it. She would see it before she made a single phone call. She would see it before she said a word to anyone, because she had been poor long enough to understand one thing with absolute clarity. Finding something and keeping it were 2 different problems. The second was almost always harder than the first. And the moment you told anyone the thing you had found became the thing other people were deciding about. She had spent her entire life in spaces where other people decided things, and the decisions were not in her favor. She was going to handle this differently. When the sun came up, she made oatmeal on the camp stove and gave Wren the last of the apple juice from the gas station. She told her daughter that there was something special about the chapel and that she needed to investigate it carefully. and that she needed Wren to do a very important job. The job was to sit on the front steps with her library book and watch the road. Watch for what, Mama? For what? For anyone coming up the road. If you see a car, you come straight inside and tell me, even if it is far away. Wren nodded with the seriousness of a child being given a real task. Yes, Mama. Adley went to the back of the Subaru. She had bought on her last trip to a hardware store before they left Portland a few basic tools she could not afford, but had bought anyway because some part of her had known she would need them. A pry bar, a heavy flashlight, work gloves, a box of contractor bags. She carried these into the chapel. She set them down beside the altar. She walked to the small storage room beside the front door, which she had glanced into the day before. It was empty except for a few abandoned items. A rusted handsaw, 3 empty paint cans, an old hymnal with its cover gone, and there on a shelf at the back under a film of dust thick enough that her fingers came away dark sat a leather-bound book. She lifted it down. The leather was cracked but intact. The book was about the size of an old family Bible. There was no title on the spine. She carried it back into the nave and laid it on a pew and opened it carefully. The pages were brittle. Heavy paper, brown ink, copper plate handwriting that had faded but was still legible. The first page held a heading in larger letters. Sanctuary Ledger of Pembroke Chapel. Beneath it a date range. Anno Domini, 1887 to 1900. Her hands began to tremble in a way she could not control. She turned the pages slowly. The book was a record. A list of names. Each entry contained a date, a name and age, a place of origin, and a brief notation. Some entries had a single line. Some had longer descriptions. The dates ranged from the chapel's founding in 1887 forward. The ledger was a record of women who had come to this chapel for help. Adley did not yet understand the full meaning of what she was reading. She did not yet know about Reverend Prudence Calloway, the woman who had founded Pembroke Chapel in 1887 as a place of refuge for women fleeing violence along the New England coast. She did not know about the network of houses that had operated quietly and without official recognition for nearly a century. She didn't know that the sanctuary ledger she now held in her hands was one of the few surviving records of one of the longest-running underground networks of its kind in American history. She only knew that she was holding something old and important and that her hands were shaking. She turned to the year 1894. She found the entries for that year, dozens of them, names she did not recognize. And then on a page near the middle she found a notation written in a different hand, a heavier pen, block letters that had pressed deeper into the paper. This day, said the noted one, Edmund Whitlock of Pembroke approached this chapel with 3 men in his service, demanding the surrender of a woman lately arrived under the name of M. Atwood, claiming her as his wife and threatening violence upon the chapel and its occupants. Reverend Calloway did refuse. Sheriff Albury did intervene. The said Edmund Whitlock departed under threat of arrest. The said M. Atwood was conveyed safely north on the following day. Adley read it 3 times. Edmund Whitlock. Whitlock. She closed the ledger very carefully. She sat for a moment in the front pew with her hands flat on the leather cover. She thought about Constance Whitlock standing in the township office in her cashmere coat, her pearls at her throat, saying, "I have lived in Pembroke all my life. The Whitlocks have been in this part of Maine since 1762. We take a great deal of pride in the preservation of our local heritage. The Whitlocks took a great deal of pride. In 1894, a man named Edmund Whitlock had come to this chapel with 3 men and demanded a woman. The chapel had refused. The chapel had stood. And the chapel had been waiting in this gray Maine quiet for 132 years. waiting for someone, waiting for something. And on a Tuesday afternoon in April, a woman with $63 in a cookie tin and a 7-year-old daughter and a husband she had buried 12 months ago had walked through its door and signed her name on a piece of paper for $1, and the chapel had let her in. Adley stood up. She picked up the pry bar. She walked back to the altar. The altar was heavier than it looked, solid oak pegged together in the manner of old furniture that had been built to last forever. She braced her feet and put her shoulder against the side of it and walked it slowly inch by inch away from its position over the floor. Her muscles burned. Her back ached. Sweat ran down her temples in the cold air of the chapel. When she had moved the altar fully aside, the section of floor it had been covering was revealed. It was perhaps 4 feet by 3 feet. The planks ran the same direction as the rest of the floor, but the wood was slightly different in color. The seams between the boards just a fraction wider. In each of the 4 corners of the section, set flush with the wood, was a small iron pin. Not nails, pins, the kind that could be removed. She put on the work gloves. She took the pry bar. She crouched at the near edge of the section and worked the tip of the bar into the seam. The wood resisted. It had been swollen tight in its frame for decades. She adjusted her grip. She put her weight on the bar. The first pin gave with a sound like a muffled gunshot, then the second, then the third. The fourth came free with a long groan that traveled up through her arms and down into her chest. She set the pry bar aside. She gripped the edge of the wooden section with both hands. She lifted. It came up, not easily, not smoothly, but it came up. She set the heavy section of floor to the side, careful not to damage the planks. Below, in the place where the floor had been, was not earth, not packed dirt, not a cellar. Stone, cut and laid with precision, the same gray Maine granite as the walls of the chapel above. Steps, 7 of them, descending into darkness, the edges worn smooth with the slow, patient wear of many feet over many years. A smell rose from the opening. Not the smell of rot, not the smell of an abandoned space. A mineral smell, cool and dry, sealed and preserved, with something underneath it, something almost metallic like the air before a lightning storm, but stilled, ancient, undisturbed. Adley turned on the heavy flashlight. She pointed the beam down into the opening. The light caught the steps, the walls of cut stone, and at the bottom, just at the edge of the flashlight's range, the beginning of a floor, and on that floor, faintly visible, shapes. Not natural shapes, not the shapes of settling stone or accumulated debris. Rectangular shapes, organized, arranged. She felt her breath stop in her throat. She stood at the top of the 7 stone steps, and the flashlight in her hand made a small trembling circle on the wall of the descending stairwell, and the cool mineral air rose around her face like a breath that had been held for 137 years and was now being slowly and finally released. From outside, through the open chapel door, she heard her daughter's voice carrying across the morning. "Mama, I see a car." Adley turned very slowly. Through the doorway, she could see the dirt road of Hollow Creek leading away through the trees, and on the road far down where it bent around the largest of the oaks, a single vehicle was approaching. Slow, deliberate, the dust rising behind it in the still spring air. A black sedan. She could not yet see the driver, but she did not need to. She knew with a certainty that was older than any thought in her conscious mind who was inside that car. And she knew that the woman who had walked into the township office yesterday in cashmere and pearls had not waited very long at all. Adley stood at the top of the 7 stone steps that descended into a dark she had not yet seen. She looked at the opening. She looked back at the door of the chapel. She looked at the flashlight in her trembling hand. And the dust on the dirt road of Hollow Creek rose into the spring air and drifted slowly through the columns of light that fell between the great oaks, and the black sedan kept coming, and the floor of Pembroke Chapel echoed beneath her feet with the patient sound of something that had somewhere to go and was finally about to get there. Adley moved fast. She did not let herself think. She slid the heavy wooden floor section back into its frame. The iron pins resisted, then settled. She gripped the edge of the altar table and walked it back foot by foot until the dust marks under its base lined up exactly with where they had originally been. She picked up the pry bar and the contractor bags and the work gloves and carried them into the small storage room and shut the door. She wiped her palms on her jeans. She walked outside. The black sedan had come to a stop at the iron gate. Constance Whitlock got out alone. She wore the same cashmere coat, the pearls. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm. She crossed the overgrown front yard, the way a woman crosses any space she has decided in advance belongs to her. And she did not look at Wren, who sat on the front step with her library book held in front of her face like a small fortress. "Mrs. Whitford," Miss Adley said. "Miss Whitford, may I have a moment of your time?" Adley stepped between Constance and the chapel door. "I'm not interested in selling. I'm not here to discuss a sale. I'm here to express my concern." "About what?" Constance smiled the smile that was not quite a smile. "About a young mother and her child living in an unheated stone building with no running water and no certificate of occupancy. Word travels in a town this size. I felt it would be uncharitable of me not to come and see if there was anything I could do to help. I do not need help." "You misunderstand me. I am not offering personal assistance. The Whitlock Family Foundation runs a small program for women in transitional housing situations. 3 months of paid lodging at a local inn, job placement assistance, educational support for your daughter. We could have you and the child in a clean room with a hot shower by sundown." Behind Adley on the front step, Wren turned a page of her library book without lowering it. Adley felt the muscle in her jaw tighten. "You drove all the way out here," she said quietly, "to offer me a room in a motel. I drove all the way out here to offer you dignity. That is not what you are offering." Constance's smile thinned. "I had hoped we could be civil. We are being civil. I am declining your offer. I am asking you to leave my property." The word "my" landed in the air between them like a coin dropping onto stone. Constance looked at her for a long moment. The pale hand at her side had closed into a fist that was not quite a fist. The leather portfolio under her arm shifted slightly. "You're making a mistake. I have made worse. My family has been in Pembroke since 1762, Miss Whitford. There is very little that happens in this county that does not eventually pass through us. Then it should pass through and keep going." The silver-haired woman took one step closer. Adley did not move. "I will offer you $12,000, Constance said. Her voice had dropped. The smile was gone now. "Cash. Today. You sign the deed back to the foundation and you and the child will be in Portland by evening with money in your pocket and no further obligation." "No." 15. "No." 20. "No." The number had climbed in less than 30 seconds, from 8,000 to 20. Adley watched the older woman's face and understood that she was looking at a person who had never in her adult life been told no by anyone who could not be replaced. The rings on Constance's fingers caught the morning light. 3 of them. 2 diamond. The third older. A heavy gold band with a small carved cross. The cross was familiar. Adley had seen it that morning, pressed into the surface of a gold bar wrapped in century-old linen. She did not yet know that, but the shape of the carving on the ring registered in her mind in the way important things do, a small filing in the back of the consciousness for later retrieval. She did not let her face change. "I would like you to leave now." Constance looked at the chapel behind her, at the leaning bell tower, At the boarded east windows, at the great oaks rising over the gray stone roof, you do not know what you are sitting on. Then leave it to me to find out. The older woman turned. She walked back across the overgrown yard. She didn't look at Wren. She didn't look back at Adley. She got into the black sedan and closed the door with a soft, expensive sound, and the car backed slowly down Hollow Creek Road in a thin cloud of April dust. Adley stood very still until the sedan was gone from sight. Then she crouched in front of her daughter and lifted the library book away from the small face behind it. Wren looked at her with grave, dark eyes. Did she want to hurt us? No, baby. Are you sure? Adley thought about the carved cross on the heavy gold ring, the way the smile had not been a real smile. I'm sure for now, she said. I'm going to keep us sure for later. Do you understand? Wren nodded slowly. I have a job for you, a different one this time. Are you ready? Yes, Mama. I need you to come inside with me. I need you to sit on the front pew with Mr. Buttonwood and your book. I need you not to come to the back of the chapel for the next hour. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see in the corner of your eye. Can you do that for me? Wren considered the request the way she considered everything. Yes, that is my girl. She brought Wren inside and settled her on the front pew with the library book and the rabbit and the last package of crackers from the gas station. Wren opened the book to the page about ospreys and began to read aloud quietly to Mr. Buttonwood in the careful voice of a child performing a duty. Adley moved the altar. She lifted the floor section. She took the heavy flashlight in her left hand and set her right hand flat against the wall of the stairwell, and she descended the 7 worn stone steps into the dark, and she did not let herself stop until she stood on the floor of the crypt of Pembroke Chapel, and the flashlight beam swept slowly across the room. The space was perhaps 25 feet long and 15 feet wide. The ceiling arched. The same gray Maine granite as the chapel above, but cut with even greater care, the joints fitted so closely that no mortar showed between the stones. Along both walls, stone shelves had been built directly into the rock, 3 tiers high, running the full length of the room. On those shelves, laid in rows with the deliberateness of objects that had been placed rather than abandoned, were rectangular packages wrapped in heavy linen. The cloth was dark with age. The twine that had once bound it had become something more like fiber, frail and patient. Adley counted them in the trembling beam. 12 on the left wall, 12 on the right wall. At the far end, a stone table set centered against the back wall. On the table, a wooden box, small, perhaps 18 inches long, secured with a brass clasp that had aged to the color of a winter sky. She walked to the nearest shelf. She picked up the package closest to her, surprised again by its weight. She set it down on the stone floor and unwrapped the cloth with hands she had ordered to be steady, and that trembled anyway. The bar revealed itself. 10 inches long, 3 inches wide, 2 inches deep. A mat finished the color of something deep in the earth before the earth gives it up. Markings pressed into one face, a small carved cross, a date in Roman numerals, MDCCLXXIX, 1889, a series of numbers below the cross that meant nothing to her at first glance that were clearly systematic. She looked at the carved cross. It was the same cross that had been on Constance Whitlock's gold ring. Adley sat back on her heels and let that fact arrange itself in her mind. Then she rewrapped the bar carefully and replaced it on the shelf and walked the length of the crypt to the stone table at the back. The brass clasp on this wooden box opened with a small sound that was almost no sound at all. The lid lifted on dry hinges that had been oiled long before her grandfather had been born. Inside, on a bed of dark cloth that had once perhaps been red, lay documents, papers thick with age folded and wrapped in a material that looked like waxed linen. the kind of preservation that had come from people who had understood that what they were storing was meant to be found. She lifted the top document with careful fingers. The handwriting was copper plate, the ink brown but legible. The English formal in the way of educated 19th century women who had been taught to write the way men were taught to argue. Property of the sanctuary of Pembroke Chapel, held in trust, deposited this 14th day of March in the year of our Lord 1889. A list followed. Numbered 1 through 24, each entry described a bar in brief Latin. Aurum purum, pure gold, each annotated with a weight in troy ounces. The weights varied between 210 and 247 troy ounces. Adley did the math in her head the way poor people do math automatically, precisely, without hope, but without stopping. She did not have a price yet. She knew she would soon. She lifted the next document. This one was a letter, 7 paragraphs, signed at the bottom with a flourishing copper plate name that she read aloud quietly to herself in the cool, sealed air of the crypt. Reverend Prudence Calloway, founder, Sanctuary of Pembroke. The letter was addressed to whomsoever shall receive this trust. Adley read it twice. The Reverend wrote that the gold had been given to the sanctuary by a benefactor whose name was not to be recorded, a woman of considerable means who had herself escaped a household of violence and had wished her wealth to serve those who came after her. The gold was held in trust for the continuance of the sanctuary's work. The Reverend wrote that the sanctuary was a place of refuge for women fleeing the violence of husbands, fathers, and brothers along the New England coast, and that it had operated quietly since 1887 with the cooperation of certain ministers, certain sheriffs, and certain women in towns from Bar Harbor down to Portsmouth. The letter said that the gold was to remain in the crypt until such time as the sanctuary itself could no longer continue its work, and only then was it to be applied to its founding purpose, the shelter and sustenance of those whom the world has forgotten. Adley held the letter in the lantern light. She read the last sentence 3 times. Should the order of this sanctuary dissolve entirely, leaving no living members and no active superior, the gold herein deposited is hereby consecrated to the purpose for which this chapel was built. That purpose being the protection of women and children abandoned by the systems of their day, and shall pass to such hands as the trust may rightly find. She closed the letter. She replaced it in the wooden box. She stood for a long moment on the stone floor of the crypt of Pembroke Chapel with the flashlight at her hip and the lantern on the stone table casting its soft yellow glow across the shelves and the wrapped packages, and she thought about Constance Whitlock and the carved cross, and about a woman named Mercy Atwood who had been brought to this chapel 132 years ago and conveyed safely north on the following day. And she understood that the cross on Constance Whitlock's ring was not a chapel cross. It was a Whitlock family crest, the same crest that had been pressed into the surface of every bar of gold in this room. The gold had not been deposited by a stranger. The gold had been brought to this chapel by a woman of the Whitlock family, a woman who had escaped her own household, a woman whose name Reverend Calloway had refused to record, a woman who had used the wealth of her oppressors to fund the rescue of other women like her, and had sealed it in stone and had walked away from it forever. Adley climbed the 7 stone steps with the lantern in her hand. She slid the floor section back into place. She moved the altar. She walked to the front pew and sat down beside her daughter. Wren did not look up from the library book. "You are back," the small voice said. "I'm back. Did you find something?" Adley looked at the cracked blue window above the altar. "Yes, baby, I did. Something good." Adley put her arm around her daughter. "Yes," she said, "something good, and something we are going to have to be careful about." Wren considered this in the way she considered things. Like Mr. Buttonwood is careful when he eats his cereal, just like that. The Pembroke Public Library sat on a corner of Center Street in a brick building that had been a bank in 1922 and had retained the heavy oak doors and the high tin ceiling of its original purpose. Adley walked in at 10 the following morning with Wren in tow and the deed to the chapel in her bag and the determination of a woman who had decided that she would not be ignorant of what she was holding for one more hour than she had to be. She left Wren in the children's section with a librarian who recognized the warning signs of a mother who needed an hour of professional childcare and did not ask any questions. She sat down at a free internet terminal in the back. She searched for the spot price of gold per troy ounce. The number appeared on the screen. She searched for the average weight of a 19th century cast gold bar. She found a reference to ecclesiastical and convent gold storage in Europe and North America, bars cast in monastic foundries to a typical specification of 200 to 240 troy ounces. She opened the calculator on her phone. She did the arithmetic 3 times, 24 bars, a median weight of 228 troy ounces per bar. The number that came back to her on the small screen of her phone was $334,800,000. $334 million. She sat with the number for a long time. She closed the calculator. She closed the browser. She opened it again. She searched for Reverend Prudence Calloway, Pembroke, Maine. She found a single brief mention in an Episcopal Women's History archive describing Reverend Calloway as the founder of an irregular sanctuary that had operated outside the formal authority of any diocese, established in 1887 and dissolved upon her death in 1923. The archive noted that the sanctuary's work had continued under successive lay caretakers until the formal dissolution of the property in 1962. She searched for Whitlock family, Pembroke, Maine. The search returned hundreds of results. The Whitlocks had been the largest landowners in Penobscot County for 6 generations. They had owned the lumber mill and the cannery. They had owned the bank. They had owned the newspaper until 1981. They had built 3 of the public buildings in town. The current matriarch was Constance Penelope Whitlock, a graduate of Wellesley, the chair of 2 charitable foundations, and a member of the boards of 4 others. There was no public record of any Whitlock having ever fled the family. But Adley already knew the woman's name had been struck from the family record on purpose. The bars in the crypt were proof. She wrote down the contact information for the Pembroke Historical Society, which was housed in an old captain's house 2 streets away. She wrote down the name of the legal aid clinic at Pembroke Community College, which she had passed on the way into town. She returned the laptop. She collected Wren from the children's section where her daughter had read 3 picture books and apparently educated the librarian about the migration patterns of common loons. Outside on the granite steps of the library, Adley stopped. She crouched to button Wren's coat. The April wind was sharp. "Mama." "Yes, baby. There's a man across the street." Adley looked up slowly. A man in a dark windbreaker stood on the opposite sidewalk with the phone held casually at his side. As soon as her eyes met his, he turned and walked east. Unhurried, the phone never quite raised to his ear, she watched him go. She did not say anything to Wren. She did not need to. The legal aid clinic at Pembroke Community College met on Tuesdays and Thursdays in a converted classroom on the 2nd floor of a building that smelled of new carpet and ambition. Adley arrived an hour before the listed open time and waited in the hallway with Wren, who had brought a different library book and was now reading about lighthouses. The man who came to unlock the door at 1 o'clock was tall and thin and walked with a slight stoop that suggested a life of leaning over desks. He wore a cardigan the color of a winter pond. He had reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead, and when he saw Adley waiting, He pushed them down and looked at her with the focused attention of a man who had decided long ago that the only useful response to most things was to pay attention to them. Cornelius Hatherton. Adelaide Whitford, I am hoping I can speak with you about a property matter. I'm the only attorney in this clinic. Mrs. Whitford. Please come in, Miss Whitford. My apologies. Inside the office was a single room with a desk and 4 chairs and a file cabinet. Cornelius Hatherton sat down behind the desk and gestured for Adley to take the chair opposite. Wren settled cross-legged on the rug with her library book. Adley had prepared. She had spent the previous evening in the chapel by lantern light, arranging the documents she had found in the wooden box into a folder she had purchased for 79 cents at the dollar store on her way out of Portland. She laid the folder on the desk and opened it. The Reverend Calloway letter, the list of bars, photographs she had taken with her phone the night before of the crypt, the shelves, the wrapped packages, one bar partly unwrapped to show its surface, and the carved cross. Photographs she had taken of the sanctuary ledger entries from 1894 referencing Edmund Whitlock. She told him the story plainly. She told him about the eviction, the dollar, the chapel, the floor that had echoed, her daughter's question, the iron ring, the ledger, the visit from Constance Whitlock at the township office, the visit at the chapel that morning, the escalating offers, the cross on the gold ring that matched the cross on the bars. She told him the appraisal she had run on the library terminal. She told him the number. Cornelius Hatherton listened without interrupting. When she had finished, he picked up the photographs and went through them slowly, one by one, his glasses now on his nose. He read the Reverend Calloway letter. He read the list of bars. He read the ledger entry about Edmund Whitlock. He set the folder down. He did not say anything for a long moment. You have not removed anything from the crypt. No, you have not told anyone else. You are the first. Miss Whitford, he said, I practiced property law in this state for 41 years before I retired to teach. I've seen exactly 2 cases in my career that involved the discovery of significant ecclesiastical assets. Both of them ended badly for the people who found them. Both of those people made the same mistake at the beginning, which was, they told the wrong person first. He took off his glasses. I'm going to tell you what I know, what I do not know, and what we are going to do. And then you are going to make every decision from here forward. I am your counsel. I am not your captain. Is that understood? Yes. Found property law in Maine is reasonably straightforward when the original owner has fully relinquished claim and there is no successor in interest. The complication here is the religious provenance. Assets held in ecclesiastical trust occupy a difficult legal space. The sanctuary you describe was an irregular foundation which actually helps your case rather than hurts it because there is no formal diocesan authority to claim succession. The trust instrument, as you have described it, is a civil charitable trust with a specific beneficiary purpose. Under Maine law, that instrument has standing. And the Whitlocks. The Whitlocks will claim that the sanctuary's assets revert to them under some theory of original donation. They will point to the cross on the bars. They will produce family records. They will argue that whatever ancestor of theirs left this gold here in 1889 did so without authority, that the property was always meant to remain in the family, that the deposit was a temporary placement that has now lapsed back to its rightful holders. Will they win? Cornelius Hatherton looked at her steadily. Not with the trust instrument you have. Not unless they can produce documentation that overrides Reverend Calloway's letter and the ledger entries, which is very unlikely. He paused. Unless they manufacture it. The word manufacture sat between them on the desk. You think they would? Miss Whitford, The Whitlock family has held this county for 264 years. They have judges, sheriffs, and notaries in their pocket going back 5 generations. I'm not telling you they will manufacture evidence. I'm telling you that we must operate as though they will. All right, there is one more thing I need to say to you before we go further. Yes, you came in here alone with a child and you laid this on my desk before you spoke to a single other person. You did not call your sister. You did not call a journalist. You did not go to the bank. You walked into a community college clinic and you asked for help from a man you had never heard of. May I ask why? Adley thought about it. Because every time in my life that I told the wrong person something important, I lost it. He nodded slowly. All right, he said. Then we will proceed. I'm taking your case under the clinic's pro bono mandate. I will work with my third-year student, Penelope Eldridge, who is the best young legal mind I have seen in 20 years, and we will move quickly. The first thing we are going to do is file a quiet title action to confirm your ownership of the chapel and its contents. We will simultaneously petition the court to recognize the trust instrument and to appoint you as administrator. I want both filings ready inside of 2 weeks. In the meantime, you and your daughter are going to need a place to live that is not a stone chapel without utilities. We will work on that. The chapel is fine for now. The chapel is not fine, but I will not argue with you. I will simply ask you to be careful. I am being careful. You are being a great deal more than that, Miss Whitford. I've been doing this for 41 years. You have the calmest head I have seen on a person in your situation. I've been preparing for situations my whole life, Mr. Hatherton. I just did not know what for. He looked at her for a long moment over the rims of his glasses. Then he reached across the desk and shook her hand. The pressure began 3 days later. The first sign was a knock on the chapel door at 7:30 in the morning. Adley had already been up for 2 hours. She'd been making oatmeal on the camp stove and reading aloud to Wren from a chapter book about a girl who lived in a lighthouse. She set down the spoon and walked to the door. The man on the front step wore a hard hat and a high-visibility vest. He had a clipboard in one hand and a tape measure clipped to his belt. Behind him, parked at the iron gate, was a white pickup truck with the words Penobscot County Building Department painted on the door. Miss Whitford. Yes, Dale Cruz, County Building Inspector. I'm here to perform a structural assessment of the property. I didn't request one. It is a routine assessment for properties recently transferred under the unclaimed estate provision. We have 90 days from the date of transfer to confirm minimum habitability. The notice from the township office said any required assessment would be initiated by my application for a certificate of occupancy. I have not made that application yet. Dale Cruz consulted his clipboard. My instructions are to perform the assessment today. Whose instructions? He hesitated. The department's. I would like to see your authorization paperwork. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had not expected to be asked. He produced a single sheet from his clipboard and handed it to her. The form was a Penobscot County Building Department inspection authorization. The signature at the bottom was Dale Cruz himself. This says you authorized yourself, department procedure. Mr. Cruz, I'm happy to schedule an assessment at a time that is convenient for both of us. I will need to see authorization signed by the department head, not by you. I will also need at least 72 hours notice, which I believe is the requirement under the Maine Homeowners Protection Statute. Until then, you are standing on private property without permission. I would like you to leave. He looked at her. He looked past her into the dim interior of the chapel. He looked at the iron pry bar leaning against the wall just inside the door. I will be back, Miss Whitford. You will be back with proper paperwork, Mr. Cruz. She closed the door. She leaned her forehead against the inside of the heavy oak. Wren came up beside her and slipped a small hand into hers. Was that a bad man? He was someone who works for a bad woman, Mrs. Whitlock. Yes, she is not going to win, Mama. Adley looked down at her daughter. How do you know? Wren shrugged with the certainty of a child who has decided a thing and considers the matter closed. Because Reverend Calloway said no to the man in 1894, she said. And the chapel is still here. And we are in it. Adley crouched and pulled her daughter against her chest and held her there in the dim light from the boarded windows for a long moment, and the chapel around them was silent except for the sound of an April wind moving in the great oaks above. The second incident came that afternoon. Adley had begun driving Wren back and forth to Pembroke Elementary, which had taken her in despite the irregular living situation, because the school principal was a woman named Mrs. Aldrich, who had looked at the temporary certificate of occupancy that Cornelius had walked through the building department 3 days earlier, and had decided that she was not in the business of creating problems for mothers who were already solving them. Wren had been at the school for 1 full week. That afternoon, when Adley pulled up to the curb at 3:15, Wren did not come out the front doors at the usual time. Adley waited 5 minutes. 10. She got out of the Subaru and walked across the parking lot toward the school office. Halfway there, she saw the patrol car parked along the side of the building. The cruiser was a dark gray with the gold seal of the Penobscot County Sheriff's Department on the door. A man in a tan uniform was standing beside it, with his hand on Wren's small shoulder. Wren was looking up at him with the quiet, wide eyes of a child who did not understand what was being asked of her, but had been raised to be polite to adults. Adley moved. She did not run. She did not yell. She walked across the parking lot at the steady pace of a woman who had decided that the situation was already in her hands. "Officer," the man turned. He was in his early 50s, heavy-set with a graying mustache and the watery blue eyes of a man who had spent 30 years drinking coffee in patrol cars. The badge on his chest read, Sheriff Hollis Marlowe. The same name that had been signed at the bottom of the manila envelope that had arrived at her apartment in Portland a year ago. The same name that had certified her husband's death as operator error. She kept her voice even. "Sheriff, is there a problem, Miss Whitford? I was just having a word with your daughter about pedestrian safety. Children should not be standing in the school parking lot unsupervised." She was standing 5 feet from the front door, waiting for me to pull around. I've been picking her up from this spot for a week. Just a friendly word. No need for concern. Take your hand off my daughter's shoulder. The sheriff smiled. It was the same kind of smile Constance Whitlock had used, the kind that had no warmth behind it. He let his hand fall away from Wren slowly. Adley took her daughter's hand. "Have a good evening, Sheriff." "You as well, Miss Whitford. We will be seeing more of each other, I expect." "I do not believe we will." She walked Wren to the Subaru. She buckled her in. She got into the driver's seat and she didn't start the car right away because her hands were shaking too hard to put the key into the ignition. Wren sat very still in the back seat. "Mama." "Yes." He smelled like the man who came to our apartment after Daddy died. Adley closed her eyes. She breathed in for 4 seconds. She breathed out for 6. "He is the same man, baby. Why is he here? I do not know yet, but I'm going to find out." That night, after Wren was asleep, Adley sat in the front pew of the chapel with her phone and Cornelius Hatherton's home number, which he had given her with explicit instructions to use it whenever she needed to. He answered on the second ring. She told him about the sheriff. There was a silence on the other end of the line. When Cornelius spoke, his voice was different. "Miss Whitford, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Hollis Marlowe has been the elected sheriff of Penobscot County for 22 years. The Whitlock family has financed every one of his campaigns. He is not your friend. He is not the law in this county. He is an instrument. I know. There is something else. You said his name was on the report determining your husband's death. Yes. I'm going to need you to bring me a copy of that report tomorrow, along with anything else you have from the packing plant case. I want to look at it. Will you do that? Yes. Do not engage with him again without me present. Do not speak to him at the school. Do not speak to him on the road. If he pulls you over, you call me from the side of the road before you roll your window down. Are we clear? We are clear. She hung up. She sat in the dim chapel with the lantern beside her, and she thought about the manila envelope. The words, operator error. The signature pressed into the page. She thought about Tobias. She thought about the way her husband had stood in the kitchen of their old apartment a week before he died, drinking coffee at the counter while she made eggs, telling her in his careful, steady voice about a new safety supervisor at the plant who was cutting corners on the equipment maintenance schedule. She remembered the way he had said it. Not angry, worried. The way Tobias was always worried for other people before he was worried for himself. She had asked him if he was going to report it. He had said he was going to give it one more week. He had not lived through the week. The third incident came the next morning. Adley walked Wren onto the playground at recess to give her daughter a hug before driving to the Pembroke Historical Society. She did this because she had decided after the previous afternoon that there were going to be moments in the next several weeks where her daughter needed to feel her physical presence, and she would create those moments wherever she could. As she crouched to fix the zipper on Wren's coat, she happened to look across the playground. A man was standing at the far end of the chain-link fence. He held a phone at chest height. The phone was angled toward the playground. He was photographing Wren. Adley stood up slowly. She did not run toward him. She walked, the way she had walked toward the sheriff. She did not look at him directly. She kept her eyes on the ground in front of her until she was 20 feet from the fence, and then she looked up and met his eyes. The man lowered the phone. He turned and walked toward a black sedan parked at the curb on the side street. Adley reached the fence as the sedan pulled away. She got the license plate. She walked back to her daughter. She finished zipping the coat. She kissed Wren's forehead. She told her to have a good day and that she loved her. And she walked across the playground to the parking lot, and she sat in her Subaru for a full 2 minutes without moving. Then she called Cornelius Hatherton. The Pembroke Historical Society occupied an old captain's house on Whiting Street. The director was a retired school teacher named Margaret Whitaker, a thin woman in her 70s with hands that shook slightly and eyes that did not. She had been expecting Adley because Cornelius had called ahead. She led Adley into a back room lined with file cabinets. Reverend Calloway is not a popular topic in Pembroke, Margaret said quietly. Not officially, not on the record, but the records exist. Where? Here, in the basement, mostly because the families that wanted them destroyed assumed they had been. She unlocked a heavy wooden cabinet. Inside were folders organized by year. What are you looking for, dear? Anything from 1962? Margaret's expression sharpened. The dissolution year, yes. Then you want the Whitlock claim. Adley felt her breath catch. There is a Whitlock claim from 1962. Of course there is. The folder Margaret pulled out was thick. The papers inside had been preserved with the careful attention of a woman who had understood what she was protecting. Adley sat at the small reading table by the window and read for an hour and a half while Margaret made tea in the next room. The story emerged. In October of 1962, 3 months after the death of the last lay caretaker of the Pembroke Sanctuary, the Whitlock family had filed a claim in Penobscot County Probate Court, asserting that the chapel and all its contents were rightful property of the Whitlock estate, on the theory that an ancestor of theirs had originally donated the land in 1885 and that the donation had been conditional on the maintenance of the chapel, which was now no longer being maintained. The claim had been filed by Constance Whitlock's grandfather, a man named Ellington Whitlock III. The presiding judge had been a man named Howard Linden. Howard Linden had ruled against the Whitlocks. The ruling had been short and decisive. The judge had found, after reviewing the original 1885 land transfer documents, that the land had not been donated by any Whitlock. It had been purchased by Reverend Prudence Calloway from a separate seller, a woman named Mary Atwood Stillwell, who had owned the parcel since 1872. The Whitlock claim had no foundation in fact. The claim was dismissed with prejudice. The judge had written in the final paragraph of his ruling a sentence that Adley read 3 times. The court further notes that the petitioners have produced no documentation of any blood relation to any member of the Pembroke Sanctuary, nor of any contractual relation to the chapel itself, and that the entire claim appears to rest on the assertion of family proximity and historical ownership of adjacent lands. Such assertion does not constitute a legal basis for the assumption of ecclesiastical assets. Adley sat very still. The Whitlocks had tried this once before. In 1962, 6 decades ago, they had failed. The claim had been dismissed with prejudice, which meant that under ordinary principles of law, they could not refile the same claim today on the same grounds, which meant they would have to manufacture new grounds, which meant Cornelius Hatherton had been right. Adley closed the folder. She thanked Margaret Whitaker. She drove back to the chapel with her hands steady on the steering wheel and her mind turning over the implications. She had been there for 40 minutes when her phone rang. The screen read, "Rosalind." She had not spoken to her sister in 9 days. She answered, "Adley, Rosalind, why did I have to find out from a stranger that you bought a chapel? I've been busy, too busy to call your own sister." "Yes, as it happens." There was a pause on the line. When Rosalind spoke again, her voice had taken on the particular careful quality that Adley had learned long ago to mistrust. The voice Rosalind used when she had decided something and was working backward from the conclusion. "Adley, listen to me. I have spoken with someone, a representative from a foundation in Pembroke, a Mrs. Whitlock." Adley closed her eyes. "She has made a very generous offer, $500,000, Adley, $500,000, for a building that the county was going to demolish next month. She wants to preserve it as a historical site. She is willing to pay what amounts to 10% of her foundation's annual budget to do it." "Adley, listen to me. This is the kind of offer that does not come twice. I'm not selling. You are not thinking clearly. You are living in a stone box with no heat. My niece is sleeping on a pew. You have a chance to walk away from this with enough money to put a down payment on a real house. Enough money to put Ren into a private school. Enough to start over. You cannot say no to that. I can. I am." "Adley, you are being stubborn. You are being proud. You always do this. Every time anything good happens, you find a way to make it harder than it needs to be." "Rosalind." "What? How did Constance Whitlock find your phone number?" The silence on the line went on for too long. "What? How did she find your number, Rosalind? Did she call you, or did you call her?" "Adley, do not be paranoid. How much did she offer you?" "What?" "Up front. To convince me. How much, Adley? How much, Rosalind?" The silence stretched. When her sister finally spoke, the voice was small. 25,000. Adley sat down on the front pew of the chapel. She put her free hand over her eyes. "You took it. It is a deposit against your sale. It is not. You took it. Adley, you took $25,000 from a woman who is trying to take everything I have. and you called me to convince me to give it to her. It is not like that. She told me you were in danger. She said the chapel was structurally unsafe. She said you were putting Ren at risk, and she just wanted to help us all reach a sensible conclusion. Adley, listen to me. She showed me the inspection report. There is asbestos. The roof is going to collapse this winter. You are going to get my niece killed. Mrs. Whitlock told you all of that. Yes, and you took her money. Adley, send it back. Adley, please. Send it back, Rosalind. Tonight. Today. I do not care how. I do not care if you have to drive it to Maine yourself. Send it back, and do not call me again until you have. Adley. She hung up. She did not throw the phone. She did not cry. She sat very still on the front pew of Pembroke Chapel in the late afternoon light coming through the cracked blue-stained glass, and she thought about the fact that the woman who had come for her chapel had reached past her to the only sister she had and had purchased her for the price of a used car. She thought about her mother in Vermont. She wondered if Constance Whitlock had reached her too. She would find out soon enough. The hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of May. Cornelius Hatherton had filed the quiet title action and the trust petition within the agreed 2 weeks, and the Whitlock Family Foundation, represented by a senior partner from a firm in Bangor named Franklin Gilchrist, had filed a counterclaim within 72 hours. The hearing would be a preliminary one set before Judge Veronica Halloran of the Penobscot County Superior Court. Cornelius had warned her about Judge Halloran. She is not corrupt, he had said, but she is conventional. She defers to local authority. She has been on the bench for 14 years. She has ruled against parties without legal representation in every property case I can remember. She will not give us the benefit of the doubt. We must come in airtight. Are we airtight? He had hesitated. We are very strong on the trust instrument. We are very strong on the historical record. We are weakest on the question of whether the trust survived the dissolution of the sanctuary in a form that can be administered by a private citizen who has been the property owner for less than 2 months. What does that mean in practice? It means the Whitlock attorneys will produce something, I do not know what yet, but they will produce something they claim entitles them to the gold. The morning of the hearing, Adley wore the gray blouse and the borrowed blue blazer and the dark slacks she had ironed 3 times. She left Wren with Mrs. Aldrich at the school, who had volunteered to keep the girl through dinner if necessary. The courtroom was on the 2nd floor of the Penobscot County Superior Court building. Constance Whitlock was already there when Adley walked in. She sat at the respondents' table beside 3 attorneys in dark suits. Franklin Gilchrist, the lead counsel, was a silver-haired man in his 60s, with the smooth, controlled movements of a man who had won many more hearings than he had lost. He didn't look at Adley as she entered. Constance did. The smile was back, the smile that had no warmth behind it. The judge entered. The hearing began. Cornelius Hatherton presented the petitioner's case first. He laid out the facts methodically. The chapel transfer, the discovery, the trust instrument, the Reverend Calloway letter. He produced the sanctuary ledger entries. He produced the 1962 ruling by Judge Howard Linden dismissing the prior Whitlock claim with prejudice. He argued that the trust was a valid, civil charitable instrument under Maine law, that the originating sanctuary had dissolved without successor, and that Adley Whitford, as the property owner and as a person fitting precisely within the trust's beneficiary description, was the proper administrator. He sat down. Franklin Gilchrist stood. "Your Honor," he said, "opposing counsel has presented an interesting historical narrative. The Whitlock Family Foundation does not dispute the existence of the sanctuary, nor the existence of the gold deposits, nor the authenticity of the 1889 trust instrument." He paused. "What we dispute is the assertion that the trust was never properly administered following the sanctuary's dissolution." He held up a single document. In our possession is a transfer deed dated September 14th, 1962. Signed by the final lay caretaker of the Pembroke Sanctuary, a woman named Sister Lucinda Marsh. The deed conveys the sanctuary's assets, including any and all materials held in trust at the chapel, to the Whitlock Family Foundation, in exchange for a perpetual covenant to maintain the chapel's grounds and to honor the spirit of the founding mission. The deed has been notarized. It has been preserved in the Whitlock family archives for 64 years. Cornelius Hatherton was on his feet. Your Honor, we have no record of this document. We have not been provided notice of its existence. We request the opportunity to examine it for authenticity. Granted, Judge Halloran said. Mr. Gilchrist, please submit the original to the clerk. Adley watched the document pass from the silver-haired attorney to the bench. She watched Judge Halloran examine it. She watched the judge nod slowly. She watched the judge look at her over the rims of her reading glasses. Miss Whitford, the judge said. On its face, this document appears to constitute a valid transfer of the trust assets predating the property's revertation to the township. While I will not rule on authenticity until your counsel has had opportunity to examine it, I'm inclined to find that the existence of such a transfer creates a serious cloud on your claim of administrator status. Pending full review, I am ordering that you vacate the chapel premises within 30 days, that all activity related to the trust assets be suspended, and that the property be placed under the temporary custody of the Whitlock Family Foundation as the apparent successor in interest. Cornelius was already speaking. Your Honor, Counselor, I have heard your arguments. My ruling stands pending the review. The gavel came down. Adley sat at the petitioner's table. She did not move. She did not speak. Across the courtroom, Constance Whitlock was rising from her chair, gathering her leather portfolio, the cashmere coat draped over her arm. She glanced once at Adley. The smile was back, the expression of a woman who had decided that the matter was finished. That night, the rain came in off the Atlantic. Adley sat in the driver's seat of the 12-year-old Subaru parked in the dirt lot beside Pembroke Chapel with the engine off and the windows half fogged, and she watched the rain run down the glass in long crooked lines that caught the orange glow of the single distant streetlight at the bend in Hollow Creek Road. In the back seat, Wren was asleep under two coats in the sleeping bag. Mr. Buttonwood was tucked under her chin. Her small breaths fogged the rear window in steady rhythmic patches. The 30-day eviction order sat folded on the passenger seat. Adley had brought everything important out of the chapel that evening. The sanctuary ledger, the photographs, the folder of documents. She had not been able to move the gold. The gold was still in the crypt. Under the order of the court, the crypt was now under the temporary custody of the Whitlock Family Foundation. Tomorrow, Constance Whitlock would have the right to enter the chapel. Tomorrow, the gold would be moved. Tomorrow, the only physical evidence Adley had of 137 years of refuge and survival would pass into the hands of the family that had spent 6 generations trying to take it. She closed her eyes. The rain came down harder. She thought about Reverend Prudence Calloway sitting at a desk in this same chapel 137 years ago, writing by candlelight in copperplate hand, to whomsoever shall receive this trust. She thought about her great-great-grandmother, Mercy Atwood Whitford, 16 years old, brought to this chapel under cover of darkness, conveyed safely north on the following day. She thought about her husband Tobias, dead in a packing plant under a report signed by Hollis Marlowe. She thought about her daughter sleeping in the back seat of a Subaru with a cracked taillight in a rainstorm in Maine. She did not let herself cry, not yet. She put her hands flat on the steering wheel. She breathed in. She breathed out. And in the dark of the Maine rain, with the chapel rising behind her in the sodium-tinted distance and the orange streetlight pulsing in the wet branches of the great oaks, Adelaide Whitford began very quietly to think. She thought all the way to morning. She did not sleep. She did not move. The rain slowed sometime around 3 and stopped near 5, and by the time the gray light came up through the wet oaks, Adelaide Whitford had a plan that was not quite a plan but was at least a direction. She had spent her life in directions. She knew how to walk one until it became something else. At 6:15 she called Cornelius Hatherton. He answered on the first ring, and his voice was the voice of a man who had also not slept. Miss Whitford. "I need you to drive with me to Augusta this morning. I had hoped you would say that. How fast can you be at the chapel? I'm already in my car." She woke Wren. She fed her granola bars in a juice box from the small cooler on the floorboard. She told her daughter that they were going on a trip and that Mrs. Aldrich had agreed to meet them at a diner on the way and to keep her for the day. Wren accepted this with the equanimity of a child who had been on a great many trips lately and had learned to trust that her mother knew where they ended. At 7:40, Adley handed Wren over at the Lobster Pot Diner outside Bangor. Mrs. Aldrich kissed the little girl on the forehead and told Adley to drive carefully and to win. At 7:50, Adley pulled the Subaru in behind Cornelius Hatherton's gray Volvo on the shoulder of Route 9. The old attorney rolled down his window. "You will follow me as far as Pittsfield. We will leave your car at the park and ride and take mine the rest of the way. The Maine State Archives opens at 9. We have an appointment at 9:15 with the senior records archivist. Her name is Dr. Eleanor Ashby. I have known her for 31 years. She has agreed to give us full access to the sanctuary records held in state custody." Why would the state hold sanctuary records? Because in 1923, when Reverend Calloway died, the state of Maine assumed temporary custody of all unincorporated religious archives in the Penobscot region, pending final disposition. Most of those records were returned, some were not. The Pembroke records were not. Why? Cornelius looked at her through the window. Because the family that had been trying to take the chapel did not want them returned. And the state archivist in 1923 was a woman named Helena Marsh, who happened to be the cousin of Mary Atwood Stillwell, who happened to be the woman who originally sold the land to Reverend Calloway in 1885. Adley stared at him. "Mr. Hatherton, yes, you knew this last night. I suspected it. I confirmed it at 4 o'clock this morning. Get in your car, Miss Whitford. We have one chance to walk into a courtroom in 24 hours with something the Whitlocks did not see coming, and I would prefer not to miss our appointment." She got in her car. The Maine State Archives building sat at the foot of Capitol Street in Augusta, a low gray structure that did not announce itself the way the buildings that mattered usually did not. Dr. Eleanor Ashby met them at the front desk. She was a small woman in her late 60s with white hair pulled into a severe knot at the back of her head, and the kind of careful, watchful eyes that Adley was learning to recognize in women who had spent their lives keeping things safe that other people had wanted to destroy. "Cornelius, Eleanor, this is the young woman, Adelaide Whitford, Dr. Ashby." The archivist took Adley's hand and held it for a moment longer than a handshake required. "Reverend Calloway's papers have been waiting for someone for 103 years, Dr. Ashby said quietly. "I had begun to think no one would come." She led them to a reading room in the basement. 3 boxes sat on a long table under fluorescent lights. The boxes were gray archival cardboard, sealed with cloth tape that had yellowed slightly at the edges. The labels on the side, written in a careful hand, a century old, read Pembroke Sanctuary, 1885 to 1923. Dr. Ashby cut the seals with a small blade. She lifted the lids. For the next 4 hours, Adley sat at the table with Cornelius Hatherton on one side and Dr. Ashby on the other, and the three of them read and sorted and photographed and marked the contents of 103 years of patient preservation. The first thing they confirmed was the original 1885 land transfer. The deed signed by Mary Atwood Stillwell and Reverend Prudence Calloway transferring 47 acres at the headland of Hollow Creek for the sum of $120. The deed was witnessed and notarized. It bore the seal of Penobscot County. It had been recorded with the county registrar on June 3, 1885. The deed proved that no Whitlock had ever held legal interest in the chapel land. The second thing they confirmed was the 1889 trust instrument. The original Reverend Calloway letter, the original list of bars, the original benefactor designation which the Reverend had in this fuller version held by the state, declined to fully redact. The benefactor was named. Esther Whitlock, formerly of this county, lately departed for the territories westward, who has chosen of her own free will to commit her dowry and inheritance to the protection of women in flight. Esther Whitlock. Adley read the name 3 times. A daughter of the Whitlock family who had escaped and who had taken with her a substantial portion of the family's transferable wealth and who had walked away from Maine forever and left her gold to a chapel that would use it to save other women like her. Dr. Ashby looked across the table at Adley. There is more. The third thing was the file that Dr. Ashby pulled from the bottom of the third box and opened with the deliberate calm of a woman who had been waiting decades to show this to someone. It was a sealed correspondence file, 22 letters, all written by Reverend Prudence Calloway between 1894 and 1922, all addressed to a single recipient, all concerning the Whitlock family. The first letter was dated December of 1894. The Reverend had written to inform the woman she was addressing that her sister Esther had passed away in Wyoming in October of that year, and that the trust deposit was therefore now permanent, and that the chapel would honor her sister's wishes for as long as the chapel stood. The recipient of the letters was named Mercy Atwood Whitford, Bar Harbor. Adley felt her breath stop. She stared at the page. Cornelius Hatherton was reading over her shoulder. He stopped breathing as well. "Miss Whitford," he said quietly. "Yes, Mercy Atwood was your great-great-grandmother. Yes, Mercy Atwood and Esther Whitlock were sisters." The room around her went very still. Dr. Ashby spoke gently. "They were not blood sisters." Read the third letter. Adley turned the pages with hands that had stopped trembling because they had moved past trembling into something steadier. The third letter was dated April of 1895. In it, Reverend Calloway addressed Mercy Atwood as her dear sister and went on to clarify for the historical record the distinction. "Dearest Mercy, I write today not in answer to your last, but to set down for posterity. For I am increasingly aware that we are recording a history that may someday need to defend itself. The truth of how you and Esther came to be sisters in this life. As you know, you arrived at our doors in the autumn of 1894 in flight from the household of Edmund Whitlock, the very man who had previously held our beloved Esther in the same bondage and whose hand had driven her westward in 1888. You came to us bearing the bruises of his cruelty and the certainty that he intended to recover you. We received you. We hid you. We sent word to Esther in the territories, who in her last days made provision that the trust she had established here in 1889 should also serve as your inheritance and the inheritance of your descendants in perpetuity by adoption of the heart and the binding of the sanctuary." Adley read the paragraph 3 times. She read the next sentence. "You are her sister now, and forever, and your daughters and their daughters and any child raised in the name of Atwood or Whitford or any name to come of your line shall be heir to this trust, as fully as Esther's own blood by the lawful instrument of this sanctuary's adoption. Cornelius set both hands flat on the table. He let out a long breath that he'd been holding for many years without knowing it. "Miss Whitford," he said, "listen to me very carefully. This letter is not just a beautiful document, it is a legal instrument. Reverend Calloway, acting in her capacity as the founding superior of an incorporated sanctuary, executed a binding adoption of Mercy Atwood into the lineal succession of the trust. In Maine in 1895, that document had the full force of testamentary inheritance. It still does. The trust did not dissolve in 1962. It dissolved only when the last lineal heir of the Atwood line ceased to exist. And the last lineal heir of the Atwood line is sitting beside me, holding the letter in her hand." Adley looked up. Dr. Eleanor Ashby was watching her with the still face of a woman who had been keeping this secret for the moment when it would be most needed. "Why?" Adley said. "Why did the state not return these papers in 1923? Why did they sit here for 103 years? Dr. Ashby answered carefully. "Because Helena Marsh, the archivist who received them, was instructed by Reverend Calloway in her final months that the papers were to be held by the state until they were requested by an heir who came in good faith and who could demonstrate need. She left specific instructions that the papers were not to be released to any Whitlock under any circumstance. Helena Marsh recorded those instructions in the Ledger of Accession in 1923. Every archivist after her has known they were here. Every archivist after her has waited. For me, for whoever came, for 103 years. Adley looked at the box. She looked at the letter in her hand. She thought about her daughter eating lunch at this moment in a diner 2.5 hours away with a school principal who had decided to be on her side. She thought about her great-great-grandmother, Mercy Atwood, 16 years old, brought to this chapel under cover of darkness, the bruises of Edmund Whitlock still on her body. She thought about Esther Whitlock dead in Wyoming in October of 1894, leaving everything she owned to her sister of the heart. Adley folded the letter carefully. She placed it back in the file. She looked across the table at Cornelius Hatherton. "What do we do now?" The old attorney smiled for the first time since she had met him. It was a small smile. It was a real one. "Now, Miss Whitford, we file the most beautiful emergency motion you will ever sign your name to. And we walk into Veronica Halloran's courtroom tomorrow morning with 137 years of waiting in our hands." They drove back to Bangor as the afternoon light went amber over the wet birches. Cornelius made phone calls from the passenger seat. Penelope Eldridge met them at the offices of the Legal Aid Clinic at 9 that night, where she had already begun drafting the emergency motion based on a phone summary Cornelius had given her at noon. The three of them worked until 2 in the morning, refining the language, attaching exhibits citing the specific Maine probate statutes that govern sanctuary adoption instruments executed prior to 1900. The motion ran 47 pages. It was filed with the clerk of Penobscot County Superior Court at 6:58 on the morning of the hearing, 2 minutes before the office officially opened by a paralegal named Devin Pruitt, who had agreed to come in early on personal favor to Cornelius after Cornelius had once represented his father pro bono in 1998. At 9:15, Adley walked into the courtroom for the second time. Constance Whitlock was already there. The cashmere coat, the pearls, the same 3 attorneys at the respondent's table. Franklin Gilchrist sat at the head with his hands folded on a leather portfolio. He looked up as Adley entered, and Adley saw something in his face that she had not seen the previous week. A flicker. The motion had reached him. Constance Whitlock had not yet read it. Adley could tell from the woman's expression. The composed surface was still in place. The hand was at her side. Constance was operating on the assumption that today was a confirmation hearing for a ruling that had already been won. Adley took her seat at the petitioner's table. Cornelius Hatherton sat beside her. The judge entered. Mr. Hatherton. Your Honor, the petitioner has filed an emergency motion this morning, along with a request for emergency review of new evidence material to the prior ruling. We respectfully ask that the court take judicial notice of the motion and consider its contents before any further action is taken on the eviction order issued at the previous hearing. Veronica Halloran looked at her clerk. The clerk handed her the 47-page motion. The judge read. The room sat in absolute silence for 11 minutes. Adley counted them on the clock above the bench. She did not look at Constance Whitlock. She did not look at Franklin Gilchrist. She looked at the brass railing of the petitioner's table, and she breathed in for 4 seconds and out for 6, and she thought about her daughter eating breakfast that morning at the diner with Mrs. Aldrich and saying, "I hope Mama wins today, ma'am." Judge Halloran finished reading. She set the motion down on the bench in front of her. She looked at Franklin Gilchrist. Counselor, were you aware of the existence of the Reverend Calloway adoption instrument of April 1895? No, Your Honor. Were you aware of the existence of the original 1885 land transfer from Mary Atwood Stillwell to Reverend Calloway? Your Honor, the Whitlock Family Foundation has long understood that the chapel land was transferred. That was not my question, Counselor. Were you aware that the deed of transfer was registered with this county and is held in the state archives in Augusta and has been a matter of public record continuously since 1885? Your Honor, yes or no? No, Your Honor. Were you aware that the 1962 transfer document you submitted last week, signed by Sister Lucinda Marsh, conveys assets that had already been adopted into the lineal trust of the Atwood succession by the 1895 instrument, and were therefore not within Sister Marsh's authority to convey? Your Honor, I would like the opportunity. Yes or no, Counselor? A long pause. No, Your Honor. Mr. Gilchrist, I want you to understand something. Last week, I issued a ruling on the basis of a document presented in good faith by your firm. I made that ruling on the assumption that the document represented the totality of the relevant historical record. I did so because the petitioner's counsel had not had the opportunity to present the contrary evidence that has now been presented to me this morning. I'm vacating that ruling, effective immediately. A sound came from the respondent's table. It was a small sound. It was Constance Whitlock making the smallest noise in the back of her throat. The judge continued. Furthermore, I'm ordering the immediate restoration of full custody of the Pembroke Chapel and its contents to the petitioner, Adelaide Whitford, pending final adjudication of the trust matter, which on the basis of the evidence presented this morning, I'm inclined to rule in the petitioner's favor. I am scheduling final adjudication for 14 days from today. Mr. Gilchrist, your firm will have the full 14 days to file any challenge to the new evidence. I will note for the record that the burden of proof has now shifted to the respondent to demonstrate cause to reject a 131-year-old testamentary instrument that has been continuously on file in the state archives. Judge Halloran took off her reading glasses. She set them down on the bench. She looked across the courtroom at Constance Whitlock. Mrs. Whitlock, I will also note on the record that the 1962 transfer document submitted by your foundation last week appears on the face of the new evidence to be of questionable provenance. I'm referring the document to the State Bureau of Investigation for forensic examination. If that examination confirms that the document was fabricated, this court will pursue every available remedy under Maine law against the parties responsible for its submission. The cashmere coat over Constance Whitlock's arm slid an inch. The composed expression slipped half an inch. The judge picked up her gavel. She brought it down once. The sound traveled through the room and settled into the wood paneling and the brass railings and the long, polished benches, and Adley Whitford sat at the petitioner's table with her hands folded in her lap and let it pass through her, and she didn't move for a long moment after the gavel had stilled. Then she stood up. She did not look at Constance Whitlock as she walked out of the courtroom. She did not need to. The forensic examination took 4 days. The 1962 transfer document submitted by the Whitlock Family Foundation was determined by a state forensic document examiner named Dr. Calvin Brewster of the State Bureau of Investigation Laboratory in Augusta to have been produced on paper manufactured no earlier than 1987, with ink consistent with a fountain pen formulation introduced to the consumer market in the mid-1990s. The notary seal on the document corresponded to a notarial commission that had been issued in 2009. The signature attributed to Sister Lucinda Marsh, who had died in 1981, did not match any verified exemplar of her handwriting from any period of her life. The document was a forgery. The forgery had been competent enough to fool a casual observer, but had not been engineered to withstand laboratory analysis because the parties who had commissioned it had not anticipated that anyone would have either the legal grounds or the resources to demand laboratory analysis. The State Bureau of Investigation report was filed with the court on the morning of the 7th day after the second hearing. That afternoon, Adley received a phone call from a detective with the Maine State Police named Sergeant Lillian Vance, who informed her that the SBI had opened a parallel investigation into the broader pattern of activity surrounding the Pembroke Chapel matter, including, but not limited to, the documented forgery, the apparent surveillance of Adley and her daughter, and the historical record of involvement of a particular county sheriff. "We will be visiting Sheriff Marlowe this evening," Sergeant Vance said. "We would like to inform him in person, I understand." "Miss Whitford, I want you to know something. Yes, I read the file on your husband's death, the original report, the one signed by Marlowe. Yes, it is not a good report. It has gaps. It will be reopened. I cannot promise you anything about how that investigation will conclude. I can promise you it will be conducted by people who do not work for the Whitlock family." Adley closed her eyes in the front pew of the chapel. She thanked the sergeant. She hung up. She sat for a long time in the dim light from the cracked blue window. 2 days later, on a Friday afternoon at 3:37 in the parking lot behind the Penobscot County Sheriff's Department building, Hollis Marlowe was placed under arrest by 2 SBI investigators on charges of evidence tampering, forgery in the second degree, and conspiracy to commit fraud against the state. As he was being escorted to the unmarked car, the sheriff turned to one of the investigators and said plainly that he would like to speak to the prosecutor about a proffer. By Saturday morning, Hollis Marlowe was sitting at a metal table in an interview room in Augusta with the Penobscot County District Attorney, an Assistant Attorney General named Adrian Pell, and his own retained attorney, and he was talking. He talked for 6 hours. He told them about the manila envelope he had signed approximately 15 months earlier on the death of a packing plant worker named Tobias Whitford, and the safety violation he had agreed to omit from the report at the request of a man named Reginald Whitlock, who was Constance Whitlock's nephew and the operating manager of the plant. He told them about the cash payment of $40,000 he had received in exchange for the omission. He told them about the 3 subsequent reports he had falsified at Whitlock direction over the following months. He told them about the standing arrangement he had maintained with the Whitlock family for the entirety of his 22-year tenure as sheriff. He told them about the night in March when a man named Augustus Linden, the grandson of the same Judge Howard Linden who had ruled against the Whitlocks in 1962, and who is now a partner at a private historical document services firm in Bangor, had been hired to produce a transfer deed dated 1962 on aged paper procured from a private dealer in Boston, and had been paid $15,000 in cash for the work, with Hollis Marlowe personally delivering the cash to Augustus Linden's office on a Tuesday afternoon at the direction of Constance Whitlock. The deal Hollis Marlowe signed reduced his exposure from a maximum of 47 years in prison to a recommended sentence of 8 to 12. Constance Whitlock was arrested at her home on Sunday evening at 7:14. The arrest was conducted by 4 SBI investigators and was photographed by a reporter from the Bangor Daily News who had received a tip from a source within the sheriff's department that wanted to demonstrate that the department was capable of cooperating with a legitimate investigation. The photograph that ran on the front page of the Monday morning paper showed Constance Whitlock being walked to a black sedan with her wrists in handcuffs and her cashmere coat draped over her shoulders by an investigator. And the look on her face was the look of a woman who had spent her entire life believing that certain consequences could not reach her, and who had just been informed otherwise. The final hearing in the chapel matter was held the following Wednesday. Constance Whitlock did not attend. Constance Whitlock was at that hour in a holding cell in Augusta, awaiting arraignment on 21 separate charges that ranged from criminal forgery to conspiracy to obstruct justice to perjury to soliciting the falsification of an official report concerning the death of a Maine resident named Tobias Whitford. Franklin Gilchrist appeared briefly at the respondents' table. He read a statement into the record. The Whitlock Family Foundation, he said, was withdrawing all claims against the Pembroke Chapel and its trust assets. The foundation was further authorizing the immediate return of all properties, documents, and considerations associated with the dispute. The foundation reserved no further legal interest in the matter. He sat down. Judge Veronica Halloran read her ruling from the bench. She found that the Reverend Calloway adoption instrument of April 1895 was a valid testamentary document under Maine law. She found that Adelaide Whitford was the lineal heir of Mercy Atwood Whitford and the lawful administrator of the Pembroke Sanctuary Trust under both the original 1889 instrument and the 1895 adoption. She found that the trust's beneficiary purpose, the protection of women and children abandoned by the systems of their day, remained valid and enforceable. She granted full title to the chapel, full administrative authority over the trust assets, and full standing to operate the property in accordance with its founding mission. She closed her ruling with a single sentence. It is the further finding of this court that the Pembroke Sanctuary Trust, by the provident foresight of its founders, has now, after 137 years of patient waiting, come into the hands for which it was always intended. This proceeding is concluded. The gavel came down. The sale of the gold was conducted over the following 4 months, under the supervision of the court-appointed trustee, a senior partner from a Boston firm named Eleanor Pemberton Hayes, who had been recommended jointly by Cornelius Hatherton and Dr. Ashby and had no prior connection to either Penobscot County or the Whitlock family. The bars were transported by armored carrier to a secure refinery in Connecticut, where each was authenticated, weighed, and assayed under chain of custody documentation. The total appraised value of the trust assets came to $334,840,000, and change almost exactly the figure Adley had calculated on a phone calculator at the public library on a Tuesday afternoon in April that already felt like another life. The funds were placed in trust under the structure Cornelius and Eleanor Pemberton Hayes designed together. Adley had specified the structure in a single conversation in Cornelius's office, sitting in the same chair where she had first laid down the dollar store folder. The Calloway Whitford Foundation would be established as a perpetual endowment. The foundation would maintain the Pembroke Chapel as a community space and active sanctuary for women and children fleeing domestic violence in the New England region, in continuation of the original 1887 mission. The foundation would distribute approximately $12 million annually in grants to crisis intervention programs, transitional housing legal aid for survivors, and educational support for the children of survivors. The foundation would fund a scholarship program at Pembroke Community College for women returning to school after leaving abusive relationships. The foundation would underwrite an emergency relief fund administered through the Maine Industrial Workers Coalition for families of workers killed in workplace incidents, with priority given to families whose cases had been compromised by inadequate or corrupted investigation. Adley took for herself, for her household, and for Wren's future an allocation that Eleanor Pemberton Hayes described as conservative in the extreme, and that Adley described as enough. It was enough to buy the chapel a real heating system, a real kitchen, a real bathroom, a real bedroom for her daughter, with a real bed and real walls and real windows that opened. It was enough to repair the bell tower and replace the failing sections of the roof, and restore the cracked blue-stained glass to the woman in blue who had watched over the nave for 137 years. It was enough to fix the cracked tail light on the Subaru. It was enough to know with a certainty she had never before in her life been allowed to know that the gap between this month and next month would not be the size of her entire life. It was enough. Rosalind drove up from Boston in the second week of June. She had wired the $25,000 back to Constance Whitlock's foundation 4 days after the call, the day before the woman had been arrested and the funds had been frozen as part of the ongoing federal review of the Whitlock estate. Rosalind had not called. Rosalind had not written. She had waited with the kind of waiting that only sisters know for some signal that the door was not entirely closed. Adley met her at the front of the chapel. Rosalind got out of her car. She had not slept well in many weeks. Adley could see it in her face, in the careful way she stood. She was holding a small white box tied with a yellow ribbon. Adley, Rosalind, I do not have the words to say what I came here to say. I should have called. You should have. I know. Why did you not? Because I was afraid you would tell me not to come, and I needed to come more than I needed permission. Adley looked at her sister for a long moment. She thought about the apartment on Ridley Street, and the $63 in the cookie tin, and the long phone call, where Rosalind's voice had gone small, and the word deposit had hung in the air between them. She thought about Wren, who was 7 years old, and who would one day perhaps need a sister of her own, and who would one day perhaps make a mistake of her own, and who would need to know that mistakes did not have to be the end of things. She held out her arms. Rosalind walked into them. Her sister cried into her shoulder for a long time, the way grown women cry when they have been holding something for too long and a place has finally been made for them to set it down. Adley did not cry. She held on. Their mother arrived 2 days later from Vermont. Hannah Whitford was 67 years old and had spent most of her life pretending that her younger daughter's circumstances were a matter of personal choice. And she walked through the front gate of Pembroke Chapel with the cautious pace of a woman who had been mentally rehearsing an apology for several weeks and was no longer certain she remembered the order of it. Adley met her on the path. Hannah looked up at the chapel. She looked at the great oaks. She looked at her daughter. Adelaide, Mama, I saw the article in the Bangor paper. I know you did. It said you were homeless. I was. You did not call me. No, Mama, I did not. The older woman's face moved through several things at once. I would not have known what to do if you had. I know. That is not an excuse. It is not an excuse, but it is true. Hannah Whitford looked at her daughter for a long moment, and the woman who had spent 50 years as Adley's mother, who had raised her in a small Vermont town on a thin teacher's pension, After Adley's father had walked out, who had never quite been able to look at Adley without seeing the particular shape of her own failures, reflected back, took a breath, and spoke a sentence she had perhaps never spoken to anyone in her life. "I am sorry, Adley. I should have done better. I should have done so much better." Adley held out her hand. Her mother took it. They walked into the chapel together. The restoration of Pembroke Chapel was completed in early autumn. Paul Dembski, the contractor, Adley had engaged on a recommendation from the Legal Aid Clinic's facilities manager, had spent 4 months and 3 weeks rebuilding the bell tower, replacing the failing sections of the slate roof, repointing the granite walls and constructing a small modern kitchen, a working bathroom, and 2 well-lit bedrooms in the rear of the building where the old storage rooms had been. The original nave had been left almost entirely as it was. The pews had been cleaned but not refinished. The wide plank oak floor had been swept and gently treated with a preservation oil, but the gaps had not been closed. The variation in the planks near the altar had not been concealed. The echo had not been silenced. The cracked blue stained glass had been restored by a conservator named Margaret Whitfield, who had spent 3 weeks removing the window panel by panel, repairing the 2 long fractures with an invisible UV adhesive process, and rehanging the woman in blue whole again, her colors deep and accurate in the autumn light. The crypt had been left intact and accessible. The shelves were empty now. The wooden box that had held the Reverend Calloway letter sat in a temperature-controlled archival display case in the corner of the nave where any visitor could see it. The original letter had been laminated for preservation and was on permanent loan to the Pembroke Historical Society. The sanctuary ledger had been digitized and the original sealed in nitrogen storage at the Maine State Archives. The first night the chapel was officially open as a community space, Adley sat in the front pew with Wren and watched 17 women and 23 children file slowly through the nave on a private tour for survivors and survivor advocates from the Coalition Against Domestic Violence in Bangor. Several of the women cried. Several of the children ran their small hands along the polished tops of the pews. One of the women, a young woman with a baby on her hip, stopped at the cracked blue window and stood looking up at it for a long time. Wren leaned against her mother's arm. "Mama." "Yes, baby." Reverend Calloway would be proud, would she not? Adley looked up at the woman in blue. "Yes, Wren, I think she would." Hollis Marlowe was sentenced in October. The judge accepted the prosecution's recommended sentence and added 2 years for the falsification of the report concerning Tobias Whitford. Marlowe did not contest the sentence. He was transferred to the medium security facility at Warren and was not expected to be released until 2036. Constance Whitlock was tried separately on 21 charges in November and December. The trial lasted 4 weeks. She was convicted on 19 of the 21 counts. The sentencing was scheduled for January. Adley did not attend the trial. She read the verdict in the Bangor Daily News at the kitchen table in the chapel on the morning it was delivered while Wren ate cereal across from her and asked her to please pass the orange juice. Reginald Whitlock, the operating manager of the packing plant where Tobias had died, was indicted in late November on charges of involuntary manslaughter conspiracy to obstruct in securing a false report from a public official. His trial was set for the following spring. The Whitlock Family Foundation was placed under federal supervision pending a full audit. By the end of the year, 3 of its 4 programs had been suspended. The foundation's chief financial officer had resigned. The Whitlock family's controlling stake in the Pembroke Mill Holding Company had been transferred under federal receivership pending the resolution of the various civil suits that were now multiplying in the wake of the criminal proceedings. Pembroke, Maine, in the fall of 2026, was a town quietly remembering itself. People who had never spoken openly began to speak. Hazel Brimley, who had worked the front desk at the township office for 27 years, gave a long interview to the Bangor Daily News in which she described the small daily compromises she had been required to make for nearly 3 decades of her professional life and the names of the people who had required them. Other interviews followed. The town did not heal all at once. Towns do not. But the air over Pembroke felt different by November in a way that was difficult to put into words and that everyone who lived there could feel. Wren turned 8 years old in mid-November. Adley threw her a birthday party in the nave. 12 children came from her second-grade class, along with their parents, along with Mrs. Aldrich, the principal, along with Mrs. Whitaker from the Historical Society, along with Cornelius Hatherton and Penelope Eldridge, along with Rosalind from Boston and Hannah from Vermont, along with 7 women from the coalition who had no children of their own and had asked if they could come anyway because they had wanted just once to be in a room where a child was being celebrated. They sang to her. They served cake. Wren blew out 8 candles. She made a wish that she would not tell her mother, although she told Mr. Buttonwood that night before bed in a careful whisper that Adley overheard from the doorway of the bedroom. The wish was that her father could see this. Adley stood in the doorway for a long moment without coming in. Then she walked into her daughter's room and sat down on the edge of the bed with the white frame and the small carved leaves and the green pillows, and she pulled her daughter against her chest, and she said in a voice that was steady and quiet and certain, "He can, baby. He absolutely can." The first snow came in early December. It came down soft and slow over the great oaks of Pembroke, dusting the gray granite of the chapel walls and settling on the slate of the new roof, and turning the iron gate at the end of the path into something out of a painting. Adley stood at the kitchen window with a cup of tea and watched it fall. The chapel kitchen, which Paul Dembski had built into the small back addition with his own hands and a great deal of pride, smelled of coffee and the cinnamon bread Wren had insisted on making before school. Wren came to stand beside her at the window. The little girl was 8 years old now. She was wearing flannel pajamas with pictures of snowy owls on them. Her hair was uncombed. She held Mr. Buttonwood under one arm. "Mama." "Yes, baby." "Is the chapel still echoing?" Adley looked at her daughter. She thought about the question. She thought about what to say. The crypt was empty now. The gold was gone, converted into the patient, steady work of a foundation that would continue to give year after year, decade after decade, for as long as the chapel stood. The shelves where the wrapped bars had lain for 137 years were bare. The space below the floor was a stone room that contained nothing now except cool, dry air and the memory of what it had held, but the floor still echoed. Adley had walked to the center of the nave the previous morning before opening the chapel for the day, and she had put her foot down deliberately on the spot near the altar where Wren had stood the first time. The sound had come back to her unchanged. The depth was still there. The resonance still traveled down through the oak and into the stone and returned to her ears with the same patient quality it had carried since the day she had first heard it. The echo did not need gold to exist. The echo had always been about the space, about the listening, about the way certain rooms in the world hold the sound of everything they have ever held and offer it back to anyone willing to be quiet enough to hear it. Adley set down the tea. She crouched in front of her daughter so that she was eye level with her. "Yes, baby. The floor is still echoing. The floor will always echo." Why? Because some places in the world are built to listen. And once a place has been built to listen, it never quite stops. Wren considered this with the gravity she brought to all important matters. What is it listening for? Adley looked at her daughter, 8 years old. the same age her own mother had been when she had lost her father in a different small town, in a different state, in a different time. Adley pulled her daughter against her chest. Outside the chapel kitchen window, the snow kept falling. The great oaks of Hollow Creek Road bent slightly under their first soft burden of the year. The bell tower stood straight and true against the gray Maine sky. The cracked blue window in the front of the nave, restored now and whole, glowed faintly in the new morning light. The woman in blue, watching out over an empty crypt and a polished oak floor and a community space whose calendar was filling up week by week, with grief support groups and reading circles and women's coalition meetings and tutoring programs and an annual Thanksgiving dinner, now in its first year, and a quietly growing list of other purposes that no one had yet imagined, but that the chapel in its long, patient way was waiting for. What is it listening for, Mama? Adley closed her eyes. She thought about Reverend Prudence Calloway writing by candlelight in March of 1889. She thought about Mercy Atwood, 16 years old, walking up the chapel steps in 1894 with her bruises and her certainty. She thought about Esther Whitlock dying in Wyoming in October of 1894 and leaving everything she had ever owned to a sister of the heart she would never see again. She thought about Tobias. She thought about all the floors she had stood on in her life, and all the times she had made a sound, and nothing had answered. She thought about a Tuesday afternoon in April when her daughter had asked the only question that had ever needed asking, in the only voice that had ever needed to ask it. "It is listening," baby, Adley said quietly into her daughter's hair, "for the next person who needs to be heard. And the one after that. And the one after that. For as long as there are people who need to be heard, the floor of this place will keep listening for them. And one day when one of them comes through that door, the floor will echo, and we will know." Wren was quiet for a long time in her mother's arms. Then, because she was 8 years old, and because she had inherited from the great-great-grandmother she had never known, and the woman in blue who watched over her mornings, and the long line of women whose names were written in copperplate ink in a book in a basement in Augusta, the simple, unshakable understanding that important things deserve to be answered carefully, she said only, "Then we should keep listening too, Mama." Adley held her daughter in the kitchen of Pembroke Chapel as the snow kept falling outside the window, and the bell tower stood straight against the morning sky, and the floor of the nave waited, as it had waited for 137 years, for whoever might come through the door next. "Yes, baby," she said, "we will keep listening too."